online folks who are probably eager for the program to start. I'm Penny Imison, and I am the director here for Rocktown History. I'm sorry, I gotta be holding these microphones, right? And it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening, and anybody who is online, thank you for joining us. I know there's a lot of activity in the area this evening, so we really appreciate you coming out for this presentation. I want everybody on their way out to see if we have some of these bookmarks available. I'm just going to quickly mention that next month's Third Thursday talk is Gary Powers, who will be speaking about his father in the Cold War. And that is a program that we had to reschedule about the U-2 incident. So we hope you'll come back for that. And we have a new exhibition opening on May the 17th. And that is in conjunction with a historic marker unveiling downtown in Harrisonburg at the Federal Courthouse. So we'd love to have people attend there and then come out for the gallery opening. That exhibition is being produced by students in the Rockingham County High Schools. And we always like to support our young historians, and it would be great if we had a nice crowd for their effort. And then there's always our coffee mills, History Book Club, so much going on. I'm not going to spend the time to explain it all now, but keep an eye on our website. You can sign up for our emails so that you're in, I'm sorry, this has been a really busy day. Yesterday was the Great Community Give. Let me start with the good news that we raised over $19,000. But we never stop fundraising. So if you're not a member, we'd love to have you join. If you walk by our donation bucket or you saw that QR code online, rocktownhistory.org, we're always accepting donations. Now, since I have a boss in the audience, I've done my job. Let's introduce Ken. We're here to hear him this evening, and very delighted that this is that we could catch him in between jaunts around the world. I put much of his biography online and in our advertising. It is amazing what this man has done, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of things in case you haven't heard, and let him fill in the blanks that he feels appropriate. Ken Rutherford is a professor in the Department of Political Science at James Madison University. He has served as the director of the Center for International Stabilization and Recovery at JMU, a Peace Corps volunteer in Mauritania, an emergency refugee coordinator in Senegal, an emergency relief officer in Kenya and Somalia, and a list of other things. He co-founded the Landmine Survivors Network and was a prominent leader in the international campaign to ban landmines, which won the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize. That's something. I feel like we're rubbing shoulders with giants here. And speaking of rubbing shoulders, he escorted Princess Diana on her last humanitarian mission to visit landmine survivors in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and he was presented a humanitarian award by Sir Paul McCartney. The stories, I just want to hear the stories. He is a published author, and this evening he is speaking on the topic of America's buried history, landmines in the Civil War. Let's give a round of applause and welcome Ken Rutherford.
Thank you, Penny. I've been in your seats many nights here, listening to other speakers over the last 15 years since I moved to the Shenandoah Valley 15 years ago, and never thinking I'll be up here speaking. So I'm really honored that Penny and her team invited me. What I'm going to share with you is something narrow about the Civil War, but I hope to broaden out to modern day politics and humanitarian suffering. But first, I'm going to introduce you to the landmine issue and how I got involved personally. I see a lot of friends here. So you know part of this story is this is my vehicle in Somalia, how I was introduced by a landmine. It was during the Black Hawk Down time period. In fact, I just emailed my wife and kids last night that Netflix dropped a 4-part episode on Black Hawk Down about a week ago, and I watched it for about 10 minutes. I was home alone, and I stopped it because I couldn't watch it anymore. Those Rangers and Delta Force arrived the same month I was there. But you can see in the upper right where the landmine was. A landmine is an underground explosive that detonates on pressure or impact. In the lower right, I was in a Toyota Land Cruiser. That's actually a Mercedes, and that's actually Kenya. They made a movie and reenacted my accident. So I took a picture of that. And then I didn't, well, some of my students did, but this is the vehicle in the lower left. And then you can see in the upper left, I tell my students at JMU, if you get anything out of my classes, Blake, what is it? Know your blood type. What else? This is one of my international law students right here. Super happy to see him. And this is my experience. I really didn't know that much about landmines. They're out there. People were getting injured, but bad things happen to other people. And I was in a non-US military controlled area, and I just figured my team, my Somali team, knew where they were going. So after my introduction to a landmine, I was in 5 hospitals in 4 countries. You can see in the lower right, I was pretty beat up. They cut me open, and they replaced my left foot, part of my left foot with my stomach muscle. The upper right, there's my beautiful fiance, girlfriend, who's now my wife, who's in the back row. I just lost my right leg. My right foot came off in Somalia. My right leg came off in Kenya. My left leg in the United States. They're in the upper left, learning how to walk. They said I want to be able to walk for my wedding, but obviously, if you know Kim, you know she's a very beautiful person. So I wanted to do that for her. In the lower left is Cambodia. I started traveling after about a year. My dream was to be a teacher. My father was a teacher, and I didn't know what my dream or what my life was going to hold until I was on my deathbed in Somalia, and I wrote my eulogy mentally, and it was to be a teacher. There's Kim. One of the reasons I'm here is she stayed by my side. This is in Reader's Digest. She's definitely the wind beneath my wings. So Reader's Digest wrote a story about it, and because I asked her to leave me. You know, you never think you're going to be legless. And I just asked her to marry me. I drove to Kenya, used a landline, drove back to Somalia, and came out of there with basically no legs. And you stayed with me, right, baby? Like after 31 years? And then this is just some parts of this is just my introduction to the landmine issue. And I was really focused at this time. I came from the international development, international relief world. So I started looking at how to bring prosthetics and support other amputees around the world, those who weren't so blessed as we are in this country. Part of that was testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the one and only landmine hearing they ever had on humanitarian, the issue of humanitarian landmines. And I talked about the parents and the fathers and the mothers in other countries who need to feed their kids, but they don't have limbs. In the upper right, organized a protest at the White House. Our church, Georgetown Presbyterian, gave us $25,000 to make it. So I try to recruit other American landmine survivors, highlighting the needs. Why not us? We have such great medical care in this country. Why don't we export that and that talent in our laws to protect the rights and dignity of people with disabilities? Here's the story. Everybody listened, but nobody did anything. We're sorry about your situation. We're sorry. And inertia is an action verb in politics. And so what we had to do is we had to recruit celebrities and other persons of high stature for our cause. There's Princess Diana in the lower left. It was the last working week of her life. It was portrayed recently in The Crown, the 6th season. They actually had an Australian actor play me. Much older. Anyway, it was all right. They never told me because they said I'm a public figure. So anyway, and there's in the middle, Prince Harry and his brother did a documentary about their mother, and they asked me to be part of it, along with one of my partners, Jerry White, who lost his leg in Israel, and It was just like, there it is. I'm asking him, like, carry the baton that your mom gave you, because she did great work for us. And there's Oprah in the lower right. A lot of instant credibility with my students at the time. Not my teaching, but being on Oprah. Anyway, the goal was not about this, but was about promoting the issue, promoting landmines, promoting the rights and dignity of people with disabilities, promoting prosthetics. Because around this time, again, that's the setup. I wrote books on landmines in 2010, Somalia on the right. These are a few of my books. But the one on the left came out in 2010, the same year I moved to the Shenandoah Valley from Missouri. In the book, I talk that World War I was the first time really landmines were used on a widespread basis, when tanks were introduced in 1917. And I moved to the Shenandoah Valley, which there's an event here that took place called the Civil War. And I started focusing on the Civil War. And there are two triggers for what I'm going to say tonight about my book and about the presentation. I didn't know anything about landmines in the American Civil War, and neither did most of the historians, because they weren't called landmines then. But I showed up at my JMU office, and one of my staff had this on the wall, Nicole Nitze. Nicole had this, I just looking at a friend of mine, had this on the wall. I was like, wow, where did that come from? And it was about landmines in America in Yorktown. I was like, I had never heard, what? And so I remembered that, and I didn't really pursue it. But one day, one of my next door neighbors was a math teacher at Harrisonburg High School, Jeff Estes. And he asked me to be a chaperone for the robotics team at Harrisonburg High School to go to a VCU in Richmond. I didn't know anything about engineering, but I wanted to explore Richmond. He wanted a driver. I was willing. Don't count on me to be an advisor. Anyway, there it is in the lower right, my Honda minivan with the Harrisonburg High School football helmet sticker in the back. And I pulled over at this historical marker to read. I love historical markers. And I pull over and I read them all, especially when Kim's not with me, because she's kind of tired of it. So she wasn't with me this day. This lecture might not be happening if she was with me that day. I pulled over at Fort Johnson. It's a housing subdivision. And there it is. That's the photograph right there. With this is a new innovative weapon was used for the first time in 1864. They're known as torpedoes, with special fuses designed to explode on contact. And it's outside of Richmond, and the Confederates dug a big hole here, and they put these unexploded artillery shells in there, and that was 1864. Or you can't hear me? I'm sorry, did I do something wrong? Okay, I'm not gonna step out of the circle anymore. Okay, is there a laser on this? It's not, because I thought I had this one. I got two mics on. One's for... Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Okay, it's not on. There we go. Okay, so this says 1864, and the cartoon in my JMU office said 1862. There's an internal inconsistency here, and so I started putting the pieces together, and I almost wish I never pulled over, because the book took 8 years to write. I was working, I had a job, but I was writing that book at 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. every day, 5 days a week. It's like 8 years. Because when you Google landmines and civil, nothing was really coming up. They're called torpedoes. They're called infernal devices. And so this is the two discoveries that I'm going to launch into my speech about how this started, with the cartoon in my JMU office and pulling over on a Harrisonburg High School field trip. So what are we talking about here? Now I'm going to go more academic a little bit. A landmine is an explosive device that can be set off by the innocent act of a civilian. In an American Civil War, they could be called, or usually called torpedoes. They're also called infernal devices or sub-terrorists, depending. And if you look on the right, that's a study we did, an aging landmine study at JMU with the chemistry department. On the right is a landmine that was in the ground for 10 years in Cambodia, and on the left, it's brand new. And we're trying to look at ways to educate young people about landmines so they don't step on them. When you step on them, they blow up. We're looking at the aging effects of explosives. But tied to this lecture, I just want to show you what a landmine looks like today. That's probably like a $3 weapon. There's like 20 million of these in the ground. The Chinese Type 72, and there's about 80 million landmines in the ground in about 60 different countries, and most of those countries are at peace. The bottom line is the landmines do not abide by peace treaties. When the war is over, the conflict continues. I call it the deadly legacy of war. Last week I gave a speech at JMU on the 50-year ending of the Vietnam War, and there's still a lot of deadly legacy of landmines, unexploded bombs, Agent Orange, etc. So the Confederacy, in this desperation, decided to innovate these unexploded artillery shells into defensive weapons. And primarily, it was because it started with the Anaconda Plan. It was the Union plan, like an anaconda snake. It was to squeeze the South, to block all the harbors, to block the rivers, so they would be unable to export cotton for cash, which the cash would come back and help support the Confederate States of America. So in the lower left, this is a map actually in my book that an artist did for me, but the Union blocked it. And the reason I wanted this was, if you look at the top, those are 2 sea mines. These are explosive devices in the water. The Confederates are spending money and innovating on explosives at sea to take on the Union Navy, because the Confederates had a very small Navy at the time. The photograph in the upper left is a hammer with an engine with a propeller designed to go into ships. That's actually in the basement of the museum at West Point in New York. And the other one is a floating explosives. My point here is at the beginning of the war, the Confederacy was investing in explosives to break the Anaconda Plan. And it never really worked, but they used this technology on land. The first time in the Western Hemisphere, the first time in the United States, the first time in North America that landmines were used is 1861 in Columbus, Kentucky. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one battle from each of the 5 years of the Civil War, and I'll close the lecture there. In Columbus, Kentucky was sort of the Fort, the Gibraltar of the Mississippi, and the Confederates laid explosives in the water and on land. And you can see, is there a laser on this? Right here, there's landmines right around here and here. And I went to the original archives to try to find where the landmines were, and they weren't in the Confederate archives, because the Union said that these weapons were inhumane, were uncivilized weapons. And any Confederate soldier or officer involved in mine laying would be executed. And so the Confederate soldiers wouldn't keep maps or directions. They don't want to be found with that stuff on it. And so a lot of this information about here comes from Union soldiers or Harper's Weekly. This is Harper's Weekly magazine, and these are Union soldiers digging up the Confederate mines. There were 0 casualties because these were command detonated mines. These were explosives. If we laid a landmine out here with a wire, it would be command detonated. And we wouldn't push the trigger or trigger it. Now they do cell phones, but we wouldn't do it unless the enemy came. It was herders or market goers or school children, we wouldn't press it. So if somebody steps on it out there, it won't go off unless the operator or one of us pressed it. So that was what was going on here. The Confederate prisoners of war helped find these mines. But there was 0. The Confederates had withdrawn from their positions. Fort Donelson in Kentucky had fallen. They couldn't protect their position in Columbus, Kentucky, so they were ordered to withdraw. And the Union found these weapons, landmines, remember, command detonated weapons. The first victim activated weapons. These are weapons that are illegal under international law. Because once you lay a landmine that's victim activated, you can't tell who the target is. The NRA says guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, here it's landmines kill people. These are indiscriminate weapons. If we lay a landmine outside that's victim activated, we'll be unable to tell. And the first time that victim activated landmines were used was in the Peninsula Campaign in Yorktown. Right here, there's Yorktown, right around where the Revolutionary War positions of the British took place. And then also on the road north of Williamsburg, when the Confederates retreated up to Richmond. This is during the Peninsula Campaign, when the Union Army landed at Fort Monroe, and the plan was to come up the peninsula and take Richmond and end the war in 1862. And the Confederates were outnumbered. It was General Johnston, soon be taken over by Robert E. Lee. And this is the Magruder Line, which is the first defensive line, and the Confederates were vastly outnumbered, so they had what they called Quaker guns. These are just basically logs looking like artillery cannons, faking it. And each soldier would have like 2 fires going and making lots of noise to tell the Union that, hey, we had the troops to defend this position. It was like 2,500 troops against 20,000, but the Union, and so the Union sat here for a long time, maybe a couple months, and Lincoln was getting upset with General McClellan, and finally, on the evening of May 4th, the Confederates were ordered to withdraw because they got intel that the Union was about to attack. And so when the Union, in the morning of May 5th, they found out that the Confederate had evacuated, they marched with their flutes and their drums and their flags going like, we just took over Yorktown. But along the way, they started getting blown up by these landmines that the Confederates had used, victim-activated mines. And here you have a more detailed picture. That's the cover of my book. Right here is Yorktown. And the Union no one had ever experienced a weapon like this, where you would just step and get blown up. And they're being blown up all over Yorktown. They're laid on the front lines. They're laid inside Yorktown, as you can see from this map. And I worked with the cartographer, Al Jesperson, on where the landmines were. And what's interesting from an academic perspective is they're only used here. They weren't used the rest of the line. And so it was basically an officer, an engineering officer who went to West Point. He was from North Carolina, who developed these weapons to use against the Union troops. And as the Confederates marched back up the peninsula, General Rains, here he is. He's called one of the bomb brothers. His other brother, George, this is Gabriel Rains, who invented, in my opinion, the landmine in the American Civil War. His brother was George Rains, who ran the Augusta Powder Mill in Augusta, Georgia, the leading producer of gunpowder for the Confederacy. And both brothers were called the Baum brothers. And this is the historical marker to the Baum brothers in New Bern, North Carolina. That's my truck. I used that for my CPA to prove that I was there and doing my research. But this is the Baum brothers, and this is their house. They both went to West Point. They both loved engineering and explosives. And so this is, I don't want to bore you with the details, but what he did is he developed a chemical mixture of potassium chlorate, sulfate, and glass to put in an artillery shell with a fuse, so when someone stepped on it, it would blow up. And this was his invention, and he was very proud of it. He also used it in Williamsburg. As the Union chased the Confederate troops back to Richmond, where the 7 Days Battle took place, they laid landmines in their wake as a delaying action, because the Union troops were moving so fast with the cavalry, and the Confederates were exhausted. Most of them were on foot, and so you're trying to delay the pursuit of the Union forces. And there are many stories of the Union soldiers getting blown up by these landmines. I had a message a couple weeks ago. There was a U.S. Army tour of this area, and they asked me about, was there any Confederate casualties? There was Confederate casualties to their own landmines, but these were more looters, or some of them drank too much, and they kind of lagged behind, and they kind of stepped on their own mines. So that's 1862. That's the first time that victim-activated mines were used, and these are the same weapons today that have killed more people than chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons combined. Let's go on to 1863, Port Hudson, Louisiana. So here is, I know we have some guests from Mississippi, or they're now Missouri residents. No, Virginia residents, Malcolm, right? Confederate flags. So this is Port Hudson, the longest siege in American military history. They're completely blocked off. They're surrounded. The Confederate forces were surrounded. And so what they used was, the Union was pouring artillery into these positions. The Confederates ran out of food. They started eating dogs, started eating mules. They ran out of ammunition, and so they repurposed a lot of the unexploded Union artillery shells as explosives. And down here, they use up here, they use command detonated mines, and down here, they use victim activated mines. And I'll go to that second. I don't want to get too detailed here, but it's the only time ever that I could find where the two tips of mines were used in the same battle. Command detonated and victim activated. This is Fort Desperate in the north of the Port Hudson battlefield. And it was a state park, beautiful state park. But you can see the desperate positions of the Confederates here. They're outmanned, outgunned, and they used, this is the historical marker. See, they call them sub-terra torpedoes. They place these artillery shells outside their defensive position with a string. So when the Union forces would come up these valleys and these hills to the forest, they would set off these explosions. Imagine the horror of running into these fields and getting blown up by these weapons. And I remember, like, I went to the battlefield. I was doing a speech, academic speech in New Orleans. I rented a pickup truck, drove up here. And I asked the ranger, what about the landmines? Oh, you know, go out there and explore. And about an hour later, someone came up to me and goes, "Are you Ken Rutherford?" I was like, "Yes, sir." He goes, "Well, I'm the superintendent. We just Googled you. We want to help you out here." So they're a big help and turn over some information. This is in the southern part of the battlefield, and this is in the museum. And these are just unexploded artillery shells. What we forget, even today, when we launch 100 bombs, there's a percentage that malfunction, like the cluster bomb. The industry says 5% doesn't go off, but it's higher than that, right, Blake? How many don't go off the cluster bombs? 30%?
I thought maybe 20.
Yeah, 25 to 30%. Okay, he's in my international law class. That's today. That's today in Iraq, in Lebanon, the Israelis. And so you could repurpose these. This is Iraq. And this is unexploded cluster bombs. These are photographs that one of my students who served in the military returned and brought back to me. And I put in here, it's like Port Hudson in 1863. The Confederates used the unexploded Union ordnance and turned them into landmines and IEDs. And here you have the same things occurring 130 years later. And this is an actual IED in Iraq with American unexploded ordnance. And there's a successful insurgent attack on an American convoy using American ordnance. And so my point here is that the Confederate soldiers were running out of ammunition. And when you're desperate and you're hungry, you want to do something. And you become inventive. Like the best hunters are hungry hunters. And they started converting these unexploded ordnance. I call it the boomerang effect, only because when I was injured in Somalia, that's what I heard. There's a lot of American weapons floating around Somalia, including American landmines. And they don't produce their own landmines. So let's just go back to here. I don't want to belabor the point, but these were, the Confederates were using federal unexploded ordnance against the federal positions, just like the insurgents in Iraq were doing, and Afghanistan, and Somalia, and in Gaza, that Hamas is using unexploded Israeli ordnance against the Israeli military. I got a file like this thick that hopefully one day, if I had a second life, I'd write about that. So let's go to 1864, Georgia. On Sherman's march to Savannah, Georgia, there's a story where his soldiers were hit by mines on the way to Savannah, and General Sherman was not very happy about that. And he wanted to load up wagons of Confederate POWs and run them over these mines. And his men said, "Stand down, you can't do that." So what they did is they marched Confederate POWs in front of Union positions on the way to Savannah, and the landmine use kind of stopped. General Sheridan did the same thing outside of Richmond in 1864. There's a couple other occasions. So on the left is the West Point military basement, the military academy. They gave me access down there. None of these are on display. And there's one on the right of an old photograph from the Civil War that someone took, and I believe it's this one right here. So it's kind of cool. It's kind of like being Sherlock Holmes and trying like, oh yeah, light bulb moment. But this is Fort McAllister in Georgia, another great state park. And this is the photograph today of Fort McAllister. The big guns are pointed at the sea, kind of like in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, right? In Aqaba, Jordan. The big guns are pointed at the sea. So when T.E. Lawrence and the Arabs came in from the desert, the Turks, the Ottomans weren't expecting it. The same thing here. The big guns are pointed at the sea, never expecting a land invasion. And so what they did, the Confederates, they chopped down these trees and they planted massive amount of minefields here, which was the #1 casualty of troops at Fort McAllister. And they're very descriptive of the Union soldiers who ran across the minefield. And that's how I open up my book, because some of them were trying to find their own limbs. And that was sort of my story. My right foot came off. I kept trying to put my right foot back on. Like when I was reading this, I was kind of like tasting blood from my own experience. I tied tourniquets around my legs, had to call for help, tried to put my right foot back on. It kept falling off. Anyway, that's the experience that I read here. And so that was Fort McAllister, and here's Fort McAllister again. Confederate landmines, like these are dream trips for me. This is in the museum, and you can see this is a Union artillery shell that didn't explode, converted into a landmine. And well, you could read it for yourself. And he said, General Sherman personally gave orders that captured Confederate garrison be required to remove the unexploded mines. This is another General Sherman story where he said, my soldiers are not going to clear these mines. It's going to be the Confederates who are going to, you prisoners of war are going to clear them. And the Confederate officers protested, and General Sherman said, stand down, this is the way it's going to be done. And some of them were lost clearing those mines. So the last two examples that come from both from 1865. This is North Carolina, Fort Fisher. The last bastion, the last port that was open to General Lee, who was being surrounded in Richmond. This is the port of entry to get the supplies up to Richmond. And this is just a very interesting case. I want to share it with you. It took a lot of time to research this. The minefield here in Port Hudson was right, on Fort Fisher was right here. The idea for the Confederate defenders was, we're going to redeploy our soldiers here because the Federal Navy was huge. It had the largest naval bombardment of the war, was on January 14th. And then we're going to be protected by minefields, so we could take soldiers from that position, redeploy them down here where we didn't put landmines. So after the largest naval bombardment of the American Civil War, the largest naval bombardment of the American military until 1917, World War I, was on Fort Fisher. And the next morning, in the lower right, the Federal troops charged across this area, as you can see from the Marines and Navy, and they took over the fort in like 2 hours. It was supposed to last a couple days. Why? What happened was, these were command detonated mines. And inadvertently, unplanned, the Union shelling broke all the wires. So when the Confederate troops were ready and they pushed the trigger and the handle to blow up the mines with Federal troops on it, nothing happened because all the wires are broken. And so the fort fell very fast in a matter of hours, and General Lee said afterwards that we are lost now after that. So I thought that was interesting. These were not victim-activated mines. The victim-activated mines, the last time they were used, ironically, was on the Appomattox Surrender Day in the afternoon. General Lee surrendered in the morning on April 9th, but they didn't get the message down in Alabama at Fort Blakely. This is Fort Blakely, Alabama. And this is on April 9th, the last massive infantry frontal assault. The Confederates were here. They laid landmines right here. You had a lot of U.S. colored troops. This is Fort Blakely here, great state park. and this is where the mines were used. I have some personal photos on the next slide, but this is so interesting because the U.S. colored troops were ordered to go to the back, and they protested. They wanted to be moved to the front because of the massacre at Fort Pillow. And they ran across the minefields. There are a lot of minefields at Fort Blakely. This is one of them. It's called Fort McDermott, but it's actually a position at Fort Blakely. And I knew mines were here, but it's in a housing. You see a housing subdivision? That's where I think the mines were. I parked my truck right here, and I walked up this little area. There's a battle flag up there. And mines were used around here. And then I started walking around some other areas, and a police car started following me because it's a housing subdivision. And I had the maps. But anyway, this is the state park, Blakefield, and Blakely. And there's my truck. And right here was the first time I felt like I was walking over ground that was previously mined. And I was super scared. You can see it rained the night before. Nobody was there. But Fort Blakely, a lot of Union soldiers were killed, and some Confederate soldiers were killed because they're worried about surrendering to U.S. colored troops and what would happen to them. So this is the place, Rebout number 4, and this is the field that I could figure out where the mines were used. And they used a lot of trip wires, the Confederates, so like tying wires to trees so the Union troops would trip and fall on the mines. So this is the last time that mines were used in combat at Fort Blakely. A wonderful experience for me, tragic for a lot of people. But this is sort of near the end of my presentation. What I did is I did a chart of all the places where I could find where landmines were used. These are the command detonated Fort Fisher that I just talked about, and Port Hudson that I also talked about, and Yellow Tavern outside of Richmond that I didn't talk about. I don't want to keep you here for a couple hours. Again, I try to highlight one battle from each year. And then tripwire at Fort Blakely, I just talked about. And then these are pressure or command detonated mines. Nuisance mines. Nuisance mines are landmines that have no military utility at all. It's kind of like what ISIS did in Iraq. You plant mine, or in Bosnia, you plant mines in front of refrigerators, or you just want to cause terror. And that only happened twice at Spanish Fort, around the watering hole, and then Yorktown inside the city. And then these were delaying actions of using landmines that Confederates were using to delay federal pursuing forces. I could find nowhere where federal forces use landmines. Landmines are a defensive weapon. They're a force multiplier. If we're defending Dayton, we're going to use landmines around here if we're outgunned by a larger army. But if we're in the offensive, we're going to take over Richmond, we're going to take over Blacksburg, we're not going to be using landmines because we're a mobile force. And we don't need it. The past is prologue. On the left and the right are Confederate mines that are currently at the West Point Military Museum in the basement in storage. The middle photo is from 2005 from the Iraqi Police Department in Baghdad. And you can see they're kind of the same mix. Landmines are a force multiplier. You don't have to be present. There's a lot of military utility to them. So the past is prologue. And I know those of you who know me know I'm very passionate about this. And I do it every day. I read it for a couple hours. And unfortunately, or fortunately, my students at JMU get a lot of this. They get a lot of this because I live and breathe this. Obviously, it affected me personally, but it's a challenge mentally and how to get our arms around it and make sure that the deadly legacy of war stops, and how to make sure weapons cease when peace treaties are signed. And this is a weapon that lives long after them, just like Agent Orange and just like a lot of other weapons out there. For example, napalm or cluster bombs, etc. So thank you all very much. I hope you appreciated that little presentation. Regardless, thank you for being here. Thank you. Yeah. And Penny, I don't know if you want me to take. Yes, sir. Eugene, thank you for being here.
you know if there's any landmines from the Civil War that maybe have been not detonated?
That's a great question, Eugene. Repeat it. Are there any legacy landmines in the Civil War out there today? And I don't think there is. One is they're kind of improvised, so water will get into the gunpowder and kind of used. And also in almost every case, Eugene, and I didn't really talk about this except in Fort McAllister, the Confederate prisoners of war had to clear their own mines. Just kind of like, so the federal troops made sure that the Confederates were clearing up their own mines. Just like, I'm just going to expand on that question a little bit. The longest minefield was from Spain to Norway, Hitler's Atlantic Wall in World War II. Those mines were cleared in about 2 years. We still have landmines from World War II in Egypt, the most landmine-infested country in the world. How did that happen into Western Europe? When we still have landmines from Cambodia and Vietnam 50 years ago, and a lot of German POWs were used to clear those beaches. A lot of them. And that's something I want to research. I went over there to study that. And some governments have said those archives will never see the light of day because a lot of them were killed, Hitler Youth and all that. The Geneva Conventions, the international humanitarian law, wasn't drafted until 1949. Article 3 says you can't use prisoners of war to clear mines anymore. So they got right in. I think they kind of maybe delayed it a little bit, cleared their minds and said, okay, well, yeah, we'll sign it. So if Israel takes Hamas prisoners, they can't force them to clear their minds. But back to your question, the Civil War, in many cases, one, Confederate prisoners of war cleaned the mines, and number two is they've probably been contaminated with water, et cetera, over time. And most of these battles took place in rural areas. You gotta remember, during the American Civil War, most battles took place not in the urban environment, like war today is mostly urban, but back then it was mostly in the countryside, so it had more of a deadly legacy, a lower deadly legacy impact because there weren't a lot of civilians there. Interesting, there could have been civilian casualties right after the Civil War, like the first couple years, and I've found a couple stories on that, mostly curious kids picking these things up, but that's it. Yes, sir.
Is there any record of landmines here in the Shenandoah Valley?
In the Shenandoah, there is. I could not find any. Maybe because it's so mobile. Landmines in Virginia, Yellow Tavern, Richmond, really on the north bank of the James River. I couldn't find any around Petersburg. Now, historians have contacted me and said landmines were used in Petersburg, but I can't find any original sources. I think by that time, the Confederate Engineering Corps was so depleted, they want to focus on Richmond. So north of the James River, a lot of the landmines were used. But in the Shenandoah Valley, no, and there can be various explanations for that. Yeah, thank you for that.
There was a lot of landmines used apparently, but what about mines for the Navy?
That's, yep. So the question is, were there mines used in the ocean? There were mines in 1860, 1861, Richmond. Actually, UVA was part of this too. I don't mean to throw UVA under the bus, but I do because I'm at JMU. But they invested a lot in sea mines and water mines to break the Anaconda Plan. But that came rapidly to a halt for various reasons. Lack of technology, lack of shipping, ineffective. And I would say, Jim, don't quote me, but I think there are 17 sea mines in the West Point Military Museum, the ones that I showed you. And the reason I show you is because 4 or 5 of them were used on land. And so what I'm trying to show is like an amphibian animal coming on shore and becoming a human. It's like using that technology that they invested in and applying it on land because of desperate means, and they don't want that research to go by the wayside or the technology. So a lot of the people involved with the sea mines and the water mines became the land engineers. Yep.
I guess you're not categorizing the Cold Harbor explosion as a landmine?
Yeah, and also there's one in Petersburg too, the crater. Yeah, that was in Petersburg. No, because those are mining, and that's where the word comes from, mining. The question is, what about the crater explosion at Petersburg, where central PA, central Pennsylvania engineers dug under the Confederate positions, laid a lot of explosives, and set it off. And that's called mining. That's the traditional, that's original sources of mining, of underground explosions. That's how they used to take over castles and other positions in Europe. So I don't categorize that. What I categorize as a landmine is an explosive device that could be detonated or set off by the victim or the tank or the individual. Yeah, but that was a tactic that was used for hundreds of years to dig under positions, lay explosives on castle walls, and in the American Civil War at the crater explosion.
That's not a indiscriminate thing.
No, that was definitely targeted. That was targeted because you wouldn't want to spend all your energy and hours and explosives on something that's doesn't have a military utility. Yeah. Oh, you all have a great night. Thank you so much. Appreciate you so much. Thank you, Penny.
We do have Ken's book for sale.
Oh.
We do have Ken's book for sale online and in the bookstore. I'm sure he'd be willing to sign one for you. And if you are shy and you would like to ask a question, I'm sure you'll wait a few minutes for that too. So thank you everybody for coming out. We welcome you back next month and enjoy this lovely spring weather.